Tonight, we are honored to host Ambassador Michael McFaul, a distinguished scholar, diplomat, and dedicated member of the Stanford community. Ambassador McFaul served as the United States ambassador to Russia from 2012 to 2014 under President Obama, leading U.S. diplomatic efforts during a pivotal period in U.S.-Russia relationships. Prior to his ambassadorship, he was special assistant to the president and senior director for Russian and Eurasian affairs at the National Security Council, where he architected President Obama's so-called Russian reset policy and played a key role in shaping U.S. policy on critical issues, including arms control, human rights, and Eurasian regional stability. A proud Stanford alumnus, Ambassador McFaul earned his BA in International Relations and Slavic Languages and his MA in Soviet and Eastern European Studies from Stanford in 1986. He then left the farm for a few years to earn his PhD in International Relations at Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. In 1995, he returned to become a member of Stanford's Political Science faculty, and following his time in public service, he returned to Stanford as a professor and currently serves as the Peter and Helen Bing Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution and as director of the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. Tonight, Ambassador McFaul brings his deep expertise to a discussion on U.S. foreign policy under the Trump administration, with a particular focus on Russia, Ukraine, and the shifting global order. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Ambassador Michael McFaul.
I'm ready.
To kickstart us though, I want to take stock first of where we are. The war in Ukraine has now persisted for more than 3 years, during which there have been over a million casualties across the two countries. Meanwhile, attention paid to the topic seems to have dwindled, especially stateside. Can you start this evening off by briefly describing the contours of the conflict since the war started and where the two countries stand now?
Well, first, thanks for having me. And I didn't know the tradition went back so far. And I know that it's a busy time of the year, so thanks for showing up. And we'll end promptly at 9, you told me to, so we won't go on too long. This is a horrible, barbaric, tragic war launched by Vladimir Putin for no good reason other than to expand the country, his country. I used to deal with Vladimir Putin when I was in the government. In fact, I met him a long time ago, even before I was in the government, and we're not exactly Facebook friends, but I've followed his career for a long time. And I think the first thing to say is that he thought this was going to be a cakewalk. He thought this was going to be an easy war, in part because of his ideological perspective about Ukrainians. He doesn't believe, oh my goodness. Hey, Joe, good to see you. I was just talking about you today, Joe. I'll catch up. No, in a good way. We'll catch up afterwards in a minute. And he thought it was going to be easy because, Putin, and I've heard him say this, he doesn't believe that Ukrainians are a separate nation. He just thinks they're Russians with accents. And he doesn't believe that, he thought that the Ukrainian military would fold easily. And by the way, I was watching in real time when I worked for NBC News, so I was commenting on the war in real time and the lead up to the war. And a lot of our CIA thought the same thing, that this was going to be an easy war, because the Russian army, when you just look at it on paper and you count out the number of soldiers and what they spend, it looks really formidable. At that time, it was the third largest army in the world. Ukrainian army was not. After getting close to that, then the first year, the Ukrainians pushed them out of a lot of territory. And in my view, had the Biden administration given the Ukrainians more weapons faster at the time, they may have had a chance to push them out. But after the fall of 2022, they basically settled into these very defensive positions, and there's been incremental progress of the Russian army, and they are incrementally gaining more territory, but very, very slowly. And instead, it's turned into a drone war. It's basically the first modern drone war where nothing on the battlefield really can move. Even tanks are useless. Lots of conventional weapons that in previous wars would have been very useful in terms of maneuvering, drones have made obsolete. But it's at a critical juncture in that President Trump and his administration has, and maybe that's more of your questions, but he's basically signaled that he's not ready to support this war forever. He doesn't like forever wars. That's what he's talked about. There's some people in my world that say there could be something in the new bill in a negotiation for Ukraine, but I think it's unlikely. And if they lose military support from the United States, then the Ukrainians will have a hard time keeping the positions they have now. They won't roll over overnight, but they worry that momentum will turn against them.
Well, thank you for that foray to my next question, which is President Trump during the election cycle claimed he could end the war within 24 hours.
Yes.
But now he says it's, quote, not America's problem. So how does this reversal affect Ukraine's negotiating position, and how does it reshape America's credibility as a global mediator, particularly in other theaters of world conflict?
So yeah, he didn't end it in a day. I think he underestimated how hard diplomacy is, especially dealing with somebody like Putin, because Putin's strategy is very clear to me. He's just accepting the concessions from the Trump administration, and then he's going to wait them out, and then he's going to fight until he at least attempts to capture the 4 territories that he's already formally annexed, 2 or 3 years ago by now. In fact, they're already part of if you buy a map in Russia, they're already part of the map you buy, right? But he doesn't occupy those territories yet. President Trump and his team, I just think had a bad strategy. You try different strategies, and we could talk about some of the things we got wrong when I was in the government. But it was a strategy of pressure on Ukraine and carrots to Putin. And if you gave Putin enough carrots, he would finally stop fighting. That was the strategy. And things like no NATO membership, no more arms, no more intelligence sharing. That was the list of things that Putin wanted. And they said, okay. And particularly his special envoy, Stephen Witkoff. Is he anybody's uncle? No? Okay, good. I don't think he's a very good negotiator. He just goes in and he sees Putin and he goes like this. Oh, it's so great to see you, Vladimir. And he comes out and he says he's not such a bad guy. You got to get to know him. I think he's a really bad guy actually, and I did get to know him. But Witkoff's strategy has been really strange to me. It's like, and it's kind of elementary. It's not even diplomacy 101, I think it's like negotiating strategy 101. Like if you give something, you want to get something in return, right? Like any people study the markets here? Like that's kind of how it works, right? And yet they never, ever have tried to get anything from the Russians. And I honestly did not understand that strategy. And now I think it's led to this situation where Putin keeps upping the ante. So just a few weeks ago, out of the blue, recognition of Crimea, first by the United States and then by Ukraine, was a new thing that had to be negotiated. And I asked, I interact with the Ukrainians fairly often, and I'm like, where did that come from? Like, who was talking about that? That was completely out of the blue. Never before had Putin said, as a precondition for the war to end, the United States has to recognize Crimea. Oh, and by the way, Ukraine does too. And that's because if you're just getting everything, it's very natural to ask for more. And that's what he's been doing. So I think the strategy has not worked. And there's good news and bad news. The good news is I think President Trump now understands that. You can see the frustration in his tweets, or he doesn't call them tweets. What are they called when they're on Truth Social? His missives, his salutations, I don't know what they're called, his blogging, his microblogging. And especially right after he met with President Zelensky, he then said, it's clear that he's getting frustrated. That's good news from my point of view. The bad news is that he's hinting about just pulling away and just pulling from the whole thing. And I got to say, I applauded President Trump when he said he wanted to negotiate. I said that publicly. I think that was a good thing. And I applauded that he decided, and it was very controversial, to open relations, diplomatic relations again with the Russians, right? He sent Secretary Rubio to Saudi Arabia to meet with Sergei Lavrov. In my world, that was controversial, and people were like, why are you talking to these people? You can't be a mediator if you don't talk to each side. But I hope that in frustration, he just doesn't walk away completely. I mean, there are scenarios under which the Ukrainians are ready for that. They've been prepared for it, but it'll make their negotiating position a lot harder.
Yeah, just to build off of that and sort of the theme of Trump's new realizations. Recently this week, he's made comments about his desire to rebuild business ties between the US and Russia. Given this and his unwillingness to impose additional sanctions, what do you perceive to be his true objectives concerning this conflict, and how might his business-oriented approach influence the United States' role in facilitating a potential resolution?
Yeah, these are serious questions. But before I answer that question, I didn't answer part of your other question, which is really important, about reputation. I think that's, like, why should you care? Like I don't know, do we have any Ukrainians here by chance? No. So why? I don't know where you're all from, but why should we care, right? I just gave a talk in Montana 2 weeks ago, and that was somebody asked, like, why should we care about Ukraine? And I think there's a lot of reasons one should care. I think it's, I think Americans, speaking for my own country, I don't want to presume I know where everybody's from, but I would like my country to be on the side of good and against evil. I'd like to be against slaughtering of civilians rather than supporting it. I would like to be against kidnapping 20,000 kids versus the other side. And I'm kind of old school, but I'd rather be on the side of the Democrats than the side of the autocrats. That's how I think. But if you don't think that way, and you don't care about those moralistic kinds of things that I just said, I think there's some big, just straight up realpolitik national security reasons. Because if we pull away and we abandon the Ukrainians, that is a signal to the rest of the world that we are not credible as a partner. And I was just in Taiwan 8 weeks ago. There's no group of people watching this closer than the Taiwanese. By the way, in several of the government offices that I went to were Ukrainian flags. So they see this connection between their fate and Ukraine's fate really, really clearly. You know who else sees it? I was just in Beijing on Monday. They're watching very closely. And when they see that we are pulling out and pulling away, the Chinese Communist Party, that is a signal that we are weak, and they are going to take advantage of that. And then all the countries in the middle, the hedgers, right? It's like, well, maybe we should lean just a little bit more towards the autocrats because the Democratic side looks weaker here and is not credibly committing the things they did before. And a lot of those swing states around the world, I think our reputation among them is damaged as well. To say nothing, obviously the Europeans, that's true. I think that's self-evident, right? That they're quite nervous about us pulling out. So I think the consequences are actually much bigger than just what happens in Ukraine. But then you just asked me a different question about trade, what the ultimate objectives are.
Trump's ultimate ambition or
yes. So I want to be clear. I'm not an expert on President Trump. I know more about Putin than I know about Trump. I've had more meetings with Putin than I had with Trump. I've only met President Trump once. It was actually a fateful meeting. It was not, I just said hello, but it was, you don't remember, you're all too young. There was a very famous White House Correspondents' Dinner in 2011, and I was there. Oh, you remember that? You remember that? So I was sitting where you are, that's where Donald Trump was sitting, right at you, yeah. And he looked at me like he knew me. We shook hands, earlier or something. And you know how it is when you're a guy like Donald Trump, you figure you know everybody, right? And even when I was ambassador, I had to pretend I knew everybody. And he kind of was looking at me like we were friends or something. And he was smiling in the beginning of that dinner, and then he stopped smiling because President Obama made fun of him for making And Obama was really funny. Go look it up. It's a really great speech. But allegedly, that's when he decided, I'm going to run for president, and the rest is history. So I'm not an expert on President Trump in terms of his thinking. I do think the Russian strategy, and I hear echoes of it when I listen to the president speak, and even when I listen to Secretary Rubio speak, is a smart one. And I'm 100% against it, I want to be clear, but I think it's smart, which is they want to say very explicitly, Mr. President, Secretary Rubio, we're great powers. We got lots of interests in the world. This Ukraine thing can't be the beginning and the end of our bigger relationship. And the Russians are leaning into exactly what you just said about trade. When just a little anecdote, because there's a Stanford hook, when Rubio and Lavrov met in Saudi Arabia, one of the backbenchers at that meeting was a Stanford grad. I used to know him. His name's Kirill Dmitriev. Kirill is the head of the Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund. And I went to hundreds of meetings with Russians for 5 years, bilateral meetings like this with Lavrov. Kirill was never in the room. He was in the room purposely because he wanted to say, if we can get over this stupid Ukraine thing and we can agree on that, we have things to offer you, right? You guys want to build data centers? We got a lot of space. You need energy for those data centers? We got a lot of energy. You need critical minerals? We got a lot of critical minerals. That's the menu that they're offering. And I think it's a smart strategy. And you see in President Trump, his comments that he wants to move in that direction. And I think ultimately having a normalized relationship with Russia where we can do those kind of big deals is something that appeals to the president. But I would say as a caveat to that, two things. One is, it was my job when I was a U.S. ambassador to encourage American investment in Russia. That was our policy back then. By the way, we encouraged Russian investment in the United States. All kinds of crazy schemes that we did, and mines in Montana, and I'm not going to get into it. I don't want to embarrass myself. But we were selling all kinds of crazy things to these really rich, then I would call them business people. Today I'd call them oligarchs. And, back in those days, they signed Rosneft, their leading oil company, and ExxonMobil. They signed the largest joint venture in the history of capitalism. It was valued at $500 billion at the time. And the peak of U.S.-Russian trade was one of the years I was ambassador, but it was 13 billion, just to give you some parameters, right? I think our trade with the Chinese is around 600 billion. But two things have happened. One, all those companies got burned. They had lost a ton of money because of Putin's crazy wars and sanctions. So the idea that they're going to be enthusiastic to come back, if they ask me, I would say don't go back. And two, I think President Trump is underestimating his society when it comes to the degree of animosity that Americans have towards Putin today. I hope it's towards Putin and not Russia, but I don't know if many polls where you get 80% of the American people agreeing. You're an expert on America, I'm not. Well, actually, I don't know. You're not. Okay, all right. There are probably some. Okay, all right. Okay, I'm not an expert on the United States, but there may be some who are. But I don't see many polls where 80% of Americans agree, but they agree that Putin's a bad guy. 80% of Americans agree. So it's going to be a heavy lift. And remember, the sanctions in 2018, under President Donald Trump, by the way, I think he sometimes forgets that he was the guy that signed the big sanction package into place in 2018. You can't lift that without a congressional approval. So I think it's actually going to be pretty hard to do, both because if you're a pragmatic, prudent business person, you should think twice before putting a lot of money into Russia. And B, I think there'll be some big barriers to any big deals.
Well, thank you. You've opened up the door to quite a few new topics there, but I want to circle back to your comments on China, and obviously you were
Okay.
just there very recently. Given the country's deepening ties with Russia, especially as a result of this war, how is China responding to the ongoing conflict in Ukraine? What are China's strategic interests in the war being prolonged? And how might an extended war benefit or challenge Beijing's geopolitical objectives?
Great questions, and I don't have great answers. I spent most of last week asking Chinese experts on Russia all your questions. I didn't deal with any of the government people, by the way, because I go to China as long as I can. I think my next book coming out in October, and you can even take your phones out and pre-order them right now. Don't do that. But it's called Autocrats versus Democrats, China, Russia, America, and the New World Disorder. And when I told one of my guests at Peking University, one of my hosts, the title of the book, his eyes went like this. And he asked me, when's the book coming out? And I said, October. He said, Mike, I don't think you'll probably never be back here because you can't use the word autocrat when talking about China, though I did frequently when I was there on purpose. So we'll come back to my own personal problems with China in a minute. You asked a more substantive question. And it's a hard, complex question. And let me say a couple of things that might sound contradictory. So at the broad level, Xi Jinping sees us as their strategic competitor, strategic enemy, I think is the word they would use. And so, and they see that as going to be a fight for decades to come. And by the way, we should too. Like, we're making so many stupid mistakes right now, like banning international students from Harvard, and you're going to compete with China like that. We'll come back to U.S.-China if you're interested, but that makes no sense to me at all. But we'll come back to U.S.-China in a minute if you're interested. So anything that is bad for us, Xi Jinping supports. So the fact that there is a war in Europe where we're sending billions of dollars and billions of dollars of weapons at the surface level, that's good for China. And they're, war over there, so we're distracted. We're not focused on places like Taiwan. Second, as you can tell from the title of my book, I actually think that regime types do matter and ideas do matter, and that it is a battle between autocrats versus Democrats. And I'm convinced that Xi Jinping thinks in a similar way. There's just no doubt in my mind. And Putin thinks in a similar way. What I'm not convinced of is whether we think in those terms. We Americans, and I'm pretty sure President Trump does not think in those terms, right? But that's the way they think about it. So Russia's an autocratic ally and a loyal ally, and they've been together for a long time. So that's second level down. But then I think it gets a little more complicated in that Xi Jinping thinks of the struggle with us as a long evolutionary struggle, right? They don't want to go to war with us over Taiwan. They want to do things gradually. And he signed up with his guy Putin, and they had this declaration of partnership with no limits that they signed it in February in 2022. And 2 weeks later, Putin invades Ukraine. And from the Chinese perspective, they're like, this guy's, they kept using, and by the way, I had to do a lot of my meetings in China in Russian because I don't speak Chinese, and a lot of their experts on Russia don't speak English. And so are there any Russian speakers here by chance? So there's hooligan, right? They kept using this word hooligan. And it seems so out of place to me and then it's like, oh, it's hooligan. It's it's the same word, and it has a meaning in Russian. And it's like Putin is this hooligan, he's he's this drunken idiot who's doing all this stupid stuff, pulling us into things that in conflicts we don't want to get into, and on the sanction stuff. And I got this strong sense it's like this guy's gone too far, and they would wish he would settle down. And you see that, by the way, in a few things. So there are these UN General Assembly votes on the war. And for 3 years, these UN General Assembly votes has been happening. And 6 or 7 countries have voted against criticism of Russia. Russia, Belarus, North Korea, the rogue states like that. You know who's abstained every single time? Xi Jinping. So he won't vote with Putin. He won't vote to protect Putin. By the way, you know who joined that rogue group in the last 2 votes? The United States of America. So in the Trump administration now, we vote along with Russia, Belarus, Sudan, Cuba, North Korea, and the United States of America. We're the coalition now that's voting against resolutions criticizing Russia, and China's still abstaining. A lot of countries vote for them, right? Our former allies. Oh, I said that came out wrong. Our existing allies, who I hope will still be our future allies. But I meant former in that we used to all vote together, and now we're in this other place. But that's an interesting thing, right? That the Chinese are like, Vladimir, you gotta calm down. And then in the longer run, I would say there's a kind of arrogance that the Chinese have. If you have dinner with them and you drink a little bit, and we're getting a little less formal, they think of their society and their country as this ancient, very cultivated civilization, and they think of the Russians as a bunch of peasants. And by the way, the Russians don't have a lot of love for the Chinese either when you talk more informally. And so is it an alliance or partnership that's close on these ideological grounds? Yes. Will there be a chance that there's this idea among some in Washington to do what's called a reverse Kissinger? Like, Kissinger went to China and pulled them away from the Soviets. So Witkoff is going to go to Moscow and pull the Russians away from the Chinese. That's not going to happen. But is it a stable, enduring relationship? I think there's under the surface there's some serious tension.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. I'm conscious of the time, and I want to make sure our eager audience gets a chance to indeed grill Ambassador McFaul. So without further ado, first hand in the back, ask away.
And can you just introduce yourself so I know who I'm talking to when you ask a question?
Yeah, my name is Mohammed. I'm a senior. I study STS, so Science Technology Society. I study catastrophic risk and solutions. So whatever's happening in Russia and Ukraine right now, it's kind of catastrophic. It is really catastrophic. Especially, I think last week I saw in the news that Russia refused to kind of go to a meeting that Zelensky, to barter some sort of trade, not trade, peace deal, but he didn't even take it seriously.
Right.
He didn't even take it seriously.
Yeah.
But Ukraine is almost like needing America to be some sort of mediator, but America itself cannot be a mediator because it's almost corrupt. And I believe something like you were part of the ambassador of Russia, during 2012 and 2014, and that was during the height of Russian trade and all that and investment. But I'm wondering did any the people in politics get hooked in, and now it's they have to appease Russia even more? And I want to bring in some context. That's kind of a question there. But with the Ogaden War, so I'm Somali, not from Somalia. I'm Kenyan, but I'm American, Minnesotan. But
That's a lot of different. I'll go a little slower. Your family's from Ogaden?
No, so my family's from the Ogaden region, which is a predominantly Somali populated area in Ethiopia. So
right.
So that part, and then my grandfather was in Ogaden. Then over time, because of the war, moved down to Kenya. And then from Kenya to Minnesota, America. So I am American at heart. And I feel like this is a very important opportunity for the United States to defend Ukraine, because in the Somali-Ogaden war, Somalia versus Ethiopia, Somalia would win. But in this war specifically, Ethiopia was backed by Cuba and the Soviet Union.
Yep.
And that war, Ogaden region, was not occupied by Ethiopians before, but they switched the Somali Ethiopian people to Somali to Ethiopian, people were ordering and making the shots, essentially. And it's new to the Ethiopian government because they've never done that in history. And I think right now it's I think Russia is just being led by this drunken person almost, because the Ukrainians are Ukrainians. Even if they have a different accent, they're still Ukrainians.
Well, they're definitely still Ukrainians. And just to be clear, that's what Putin thinks of them. That's not what I think of them. I'm a deep admirer of Ukrainian society and resilience, and they stopped the Russian army. Our weapons didn't stop them. Our weapons came in later. But you're right about what happened last week about Putin, and it's still not done. We still have to be cautiously optimistic. They might start these negotiations, but the Ukraine, well, it was all, Trump says there should be a ceasefire, and so Zelensky says, I agree. And he said 30-day unconditional ceasefire. The Ukrainians said yes, and then they put the ball in Putin's court. And then he said, no, before we do that, we need to have face-to-face talks. And then Trump said, that's a good idea. And Zelensky's he's a very talented guy when it comes to messaging. And he said, Trump's right, I'll go face-to-face with Putin. And he got on a plane and he showed up in Turkey. He was there. And he called Putin's bluff. And Putin instead sent, no disrespect to him, although he's a pretty disrespectful guy, he sent his Minister of Culture, Medinsky's his name, instead, right? So that was a signal that maybe he was not serious, and that's when Trump began to criticize him. That said, Putin also faces challenges at home. This is an expensive war. Hundreds of thousands of young men have died. A million, I think you had all the statistics. This has not been an easy war for Russia, and they're making incremental gains, but really, really incremental progress. So I could imagine a scenario that he might, in a move to really pivot to a closer relationship with the United States, maybe he would agree to a ceasefire, but I give it a low probability.
Johnny.
Hi, I'm Johnny. I'm an aerospace engineer, and I'm really curious how you think the end of this war could affect U.S. national defense policy, especially if we're going more into treating Russia as an economic ally rather than a political enemy.
Well, I don't know. I mean, first thing I always say about predicting the future, I don't know, and don't believe anybody who says they know. I actually think the real opportunity for American defense and defense, you're in aerospace, you said, right?
Yeah.
Including like your field. Invest in Ukraine, man. And I got some people who will take your money. No, I'm just kidding. They want your brains, is what they want. Because what has happened, tragically, I want to be clear about this, tragically, but what has happened is because Ukraine has been fighting for a long time, they've started to develop their own military industrial complex. They have their own industries, and especially their drone companies on sea and in the air, but especially their sea drones. They took out the Russian fleet. The Russian fleet had to leave where they were based in Crimea to go back to a safer port, Novorossiysk, because these sea drones were taking out their ships. And one of the founders of that company, he's another former Stanford guy, by the way. He was a visiting fellow here for 6 months at Freeman Spogli Institute that I run. He's the former prime minister of Ukraine, and then when the war started, everybody scrambled to do something new, and he started this sea drone company. And he thinks that they are way farther ahead than our companies, that they're pretty dismissive of American drones. I'm not an expert on drones, maybe you are, but so I'm just reporting what they say. And it's not because our technology is better or worse, just because they have gained so much data. It's a software thing as much as a hardware thing. And they're running missions every night with tons and tons of data is being gathered. And they think that when the war ends, they could become a piece of the Western democratic military complex, especially at a time when Europe needs to be doing more in defense, right? And then the second thing, if he were here, or the defense minister is also a colleague of ours over at FSI. He used to be a donor, actually, to Stanford. He's a business guy, and he started a program for Ukrainian leadership here about 10 years ago. And then the war started, and he joined, and then he became the defense minister. But what he would say, in addition to just drones, is like, who has the most experienced army in all of Europe right now? It's Ukraine. No disrespect to the British or the Germans, the French, but they have a bigger army and a more experienced army. So they are hopeful that when this horrible war ends, that they could be a provider of security for Europe, as opposed, right now they've been this importer of security, right? And by the way, they hate it, just so you know. It's embarrassing that they have to keep asking for money. They want to get out of that. But they think in the long term, they could be, both partners with, the company that you're going to found, and for Europe as a whole, like, we need to fortify Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, and at a time when our president and our society is saying, hey, we don't want our soldiers on those frontline states, the Ukrainian soldiers, I think, could be a good replacement.
In the back left there.
Hey there, good to see you again. I'm Joe, MBA International Policy Master's student. I wanted to talk about the news of the day that you referenced a little bit earlier with the international students at Harvard.
Okay.
I think you stated your position. And
I haven't stated my whole position yet, Joe.
Well,
I got a lot to say.
I'm curious to hear a little bit more on that. I think one thing that I would say is that while I'm not in favor of banning all international students from American universities, I do think that it's highly concerning that we are training some students who are either agents of foreign governments or who are directly hostile to the United States. The Stanford Review, as you probably saw, that's been reporting on this recently. And for a research project, I also did some polling of the student body, both undergraduate and graduate, and found that a third of all students, but closer to 40% of international students, consider themselves either somewhat or very anti-American. To me, it makes no sense that one of the country's leading American institutions that has tons of American students vying for spots here would be educating and pouring resources into people who are going to help foreign governments or who are blatantly anti-patriotic or even worse, anti-American. Also, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me that we're admitting people like Xi Jinping's daughter to study at Harvard when she received a degree, I think, back in 2012. So I'm curious your position on that. Do you think that we should be more careful or place more restrictions on particularly hostile or adversarial nations? Where do you draw the line on who should and shouldn't be allowed to study here?
Yeah. So those are good questions, hard questions, and I don't have easy answers to them. Do I want spies at Stanford University? And if you are a spy in this room, no, I don't want spies at Stanford. And I've dealt with spies for a good portion of my life, right? So we need to have better ways to reduce, we'll never get it to zero, but to keep people who are intelligence officers off of our campuses. I strongly believe that. I do not believe that's the role of the universities, because we don't have the intelligence to do that. I've dealt with the FBI, with people on this campus for a long, long time. They have, for obvious reason, they have data that we don't have. And the policing of that should come, in my view, when you get a visa to come into this country. That's the moment. And we have a system. I was the U.S. ambassador in Russia. We have a system where it's called the Viper system. At least that's what it was called when I was there, where we have special screening for special kinds of people to prevent terrorists and spies from coming into our country. And I think that system's kind of broken down, obviously. In my view, we've got to make it more robust. So that's number one. But number two, as somebody who believes we are going to be competing with China for decades to come, and my book is all about this, because you read part of it. It's much better, Joe, now than it was when you took my class. I go through this book and I look at, it's first about the balance of power between China, Russia, and the United States, ideology, like the snapshot of where we're at, and then I have these prescriptive chapters. And I have one set of prescriptions that are mistakes from the Cold War that we don't want to do again. And then I have successes in the Cold War we want to replicate, and I have a third chapter that's are about new problems that have nothing to do with the Cold War, and so the Cold War metaphor screws things up. In in the mistakes chapter, I have a section on McCarthyism, where I studied that history, and that didn't do us any good. We purged the State Department of all of our experts on China. That hurt our national interests. But in the successes, I talk about all of our soft power instruments of global power, and I won't try to go through them all now unless you want me to. I'm happy to, but we did do some really good things then, and one of the things we did was we became a magnet for the most talented people in the world. And I'm assuming some of them are sitting in this room right now. And that was a great advantage to us back then and today for multiple reasons. So the obvious reason is a lot of those people came and wanted to stay. Now you're talking about a new phenomenon that is new, and we'll come back to that if we have time, about there's more anti-Americanism among international students, and I just spent a ton of time talking about this at 3 universities in Beijing. But generally speaking, people come here, they want to study here, and a lot of people want to stay. And that makes America great again. That is what makes us great. That's the great superpower that we got that the Chinese and the Iranians and the Russians don't have. They have to give all kinds of money and incentives. They're running the play, by the way. They've studied. I just was at Renmin University, People's University, and I met with one of their vice rectors, and he's like, Mr. Professor, we have this great new program. It's called the Leadership Academy. And he said, we studied what they do at the Kennedy School, and we're replicating it here, but we're smarter than you Americans. We identify people that already have power. You're taking chances on this crowd, who knows what you're going to do. And he was very proud of it. I was like, wow, this is insane. Vice ministers from all kinds of places, all over the world, mostly in Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East and Asia. And then they come and they become PhD students. And I was like, oh, really? They take 5 years off to do their PhD at Renda. How can they do that? He said, well, of course they don't do that. They just come for 2 days, and they interact with us, and then they go back to their job, and they come back in 6 months, and then in 3 years' time, we give them a PhD. Brilliant, right? Who doesn't want, well, everybody would rather have a PhD from Stanford, but think about what they're doing there, right? They're co-opting all these leaders who are already in place. So we got to keep upping our game to keep up with those folks. And I worry about if we had these policies in place 30 years ago, Tesla would have been set up in the UK, where Oxford graduate Elon Musk would have set up his company. NVIDIA would be in Beijing because Jensen Huang would have gone to Tsinghua. And Sergey Brin, instead of having Google down the road, he would have gone to Moscow State because he couldn't get a visa to come to Stanford, and they would have Google and we wouldn't. And I just think that is our superpower. It is, we got some things that I'm scared to death of with the Chinese in terms of competition, where I think we're behind. This is our really great strength. And therefore, I think we just got to rethink it. And then I'm going to say one thing that's really personal about me. So there's a lot of universities, maybe not Harvard, but I don't know how it works at Harvard. But Stanford, when I was here, international students paid full freight, right? 100%. I don't know how it is today. I think we're better at it. But when I was a student here, I was really, really thankful for those foreigners that came, those international students, and paid the full tuition, because you know what I paid? My family contribution was $400. So those international students were subsidizing my ability to be here. And Stanford and Harvard, they're probably rich enough to survive that, but there are a lot of schools in red states in the Midwest that if they don't have any international students, the tuition for all the poor kids like me is going to go way up, and I might not have been able to go to Stanford, and then I never would have met you, Joe. So it's an ecosystem that's got to be tweaked. You heard what I said, it's got to be tweaked, but I think this is a big advantage we have that we just cannot give away lately.
There. Yes, please.
Hi, Ambassador McFaul. My name is Wayne Song. I'm from Boise, Idaho. Freshman here.
You are? Great. I'm from Bozeman, Montana.
Wow.
Down the road from you.
Yeah.
Boise is a giant metropolis compared to where I'm from. So.
My question is kind of a follow-up to his question. You kind of alluded to a lot of things in the Cold War. You also kind of alluded to, some other battles, like perhaps World War II. And I was wondering, do you think we are in Cold War Part 2? Do you think we'll be in World War III? And if so, like, what can we do about it as perhaps diplomats down the road, or perhaps world leaders?
Again, these are all big, hard questions, and I don't have an easy answer to that. So instead, I had to write a whole book to answer your question, and I'm not kidding. I wrote this book precisely to answer your question, because around 2017, the beginning of the first Trump administration, his team, in fact, some of our colleagues here at the Hoover Institution were instrumental in writing it. H.R. McMaster, they wrote a new national security strategy identifying, in my opinion, rightly, this great power competition that we're going to have with China and Russia for a long time, right? And then it started a debate about, is it a new Cold War or not? And I was intrigued by that debate, and I participated in it. And I went to conferences, over at Hoover, we had some conferences on it. And my answer is it's some things are similar and some things are different. And we got to understand that complexity if we're going to devise policies that will be successful. The negative consequence of that from my book is that it's really long, it's really complex and maybe boring. But I think if we just cartoonize it, that yes, it is Cold War 2.0, or no, it's not, and that was kind of the debate when I started writing this book. I think both those camps are wrong. And in some ways, I think the threat today is less. So I don't think that the Chinese are seeking to make the whole world communist. I don't think that, after working on this book for years. And I don't think they have the capacity to do it, even if they wanted to. The Soviets, that's what they wanted, and the Soviets invested in it, and the Soviets would, arm guerrillas to overthrow regimes to make them Marxist-Leninists. That's a bigger threat, in my opinion, than we are in today. By the way, the Cold War was not cold. Millions of people died during the Cold War, right? They died in Korea, they've died in Vietnam, they died in Angola, they died in Hungary, they died in Afghanistan, because the Soviets were much more serious about exporting communism, and we were serious about checking that. And so I think that's a lesser threat. At the same time, the fact that Putin has pulled off a full-scale war similar to World War II in Europe, and nuclear weapons did not deter it. We used to think in the Cold War there would never be big wars like this because we would be so fearful of nuclear weapons that would deter these kind of wars, and that he's pulled it off without nuclear weapons deterring it. That makes me worried that we could fall into a war with Russia, and we might stumble into a war with China over Taiwan, and that nuclear deterrence is not working. So I think some parts are less dangerous, some parts are more, and I'm very optimistic that I would rather be on, Team Blue, the Democratic side, than the autocratic side. I think we have resources, alliances, and better ideas and better innovative schemes, as long as we think in those terms. And my biggest worry today is mostly about internal stuff. Another thing we didn't have during the Cold War is we didn't have the level of polarization in our country that we have today. Another unique moment today compared to the Cold War is we didn't have these isolationist tendencies as rigorous in both Democratic and Republican parties, by the way. It's not just in the Republican Party. Those things make me worried. But I'm still, in the long run, if we can figure out a way to get over those things, I think we can manage this competition with both China and Russia. But for the longer answer, October 28th is the release date. So.
Look how eager our audience is.
Yes,
I think we have time
everybody
for
likes to talk about the Cold War.
Yeah, probably 2 more questions. In the front here. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for your time. My name is Melena Kakor, I'm a senior here. We've talked about policy tonight, but at the top you also mentioned you work for NBC, and obviously you do a lot of public-facing work for FSI and what you're doing right now. And I'm curious if you can speak a little bit to how you deal with compassion fatigue amongst everyday people, especially in a climate where there's a war in Ukraine, but there's also conflict in the Middle East. There's also unresolved humanitarian conflicts all over the world.
Yeah.
How do you think about reaching people who maybe have a human instinct within them to care, but feel like so many years on, it's hard to wake up every day with that same motivation?
Again, fantastic questions. What's your group called? The
Stanford
Political Union. This is a good group.
Instagram, if you want to.
All right, I'll follow you on Instagram. I'll like you on Instagram, and you can follow me on X. How about that? Good. We'll amplify each other. How many followers do you guys have?
Nathan, how many followers?
Over 300.
Over 300. Okay. Well, I got about 1 million on my platform, so I'll try to boost. Win-win. So that's a great question, and I haven't thought of it systematically. I'm exhausted. I'll tell you honestly. I just had some Russians over for dinner yesterday. They're all living in exile. One of them is a daughter of a friend of mine who was assassinated in Russia in 2015. And it's just the weight of it all. I got kind of emotional because it's just the weight of they're all battling Putin from, abroad and afar and with not many results. And it just felt overwhelming, right? And the Ukraine war, like I say, I talk to Ukrainians often, and talk about heaviness. There's a heaviness there. And then there's a sadness about the absence of engagement from our societies, right? And we're distracted with our own problems. And I work for NBC, and so I can tell you that the coverage of Ukraine it's still there, but it's not like it used to be. But I'm just restating your problem. I'm not answering your question. I guess I would say for me personally, and I don't want to generalize for anybody else, but I think about 2 things that I want to do kind of short term and long term. So the short term is to focus on the things where I can have some impact. So there's a lot of people that what I say about Ukraine matters, whereas what I say about Gaza nobody cares. What I say about Trump, nobody cares. So I think for me, I have to be more focused, because if I'm just like popping off, and sometimes I do, by the way, on Twitter, it's like 30 tweets later, I'm like, I got an opinion about everything. I think I gotta be more focused on the things that I can add value to, and maybe that's one piece of advice, because you can't do everything and you'll be overwhelmed, and it's important to have little victories, like little things so I run a sanctions group, and we just wrote a new paper on sanctions about how to put more pressure on Russia, and the Europeans just met and passed a new sanctions package, and they didn't do 90% of what we wanted, but as one of my Ukrainian friends said, well, they did do 10%. Let's focus on the 10% and call it a victory rather than all the things they didn't do. So that's on that piece. On the broader question about America's place in the world, I run FSI. I'm about to step down from that job, and I just finished this book. I think, and this is actually an answer about the universities. To go back to Joe's question. I strongly feel that the arguments, because it's late, let's make it oversimplify, right? It's way more complex than that, but it's because it's almost 9 o'clock. So I'm a liberal internationalist, right? And in terms of my worldview, and I think that's a moral position, but I also think it's the best strategy for the United States. But I feel like people of my orientation have lost the debate. We've lost the debate in America. And so how did foreign assistance just get wiped out? Because nobody was making an argument for why foreign assistance. University funding, I just was talking to a student today. It's like, help make the argument for why the US government should be giving billions of dollars to one of the richest universities in the world, not Stanford, Harvard. And I think we got to go make that argument. I think we've got to get better, if you believe what I do, and not just go to Cambridge and Palo Alto, but go to Boise. I've given talks in Boise, by the way, and I'm going back on my book tour. But I think we have to first figure out what the argument is. I don't think it's very clear. I think we've got to be more precise about it, and then help people understand why these things that don't have tangible benefits today, like investing in cancer research at Harvard or USAID programs in Moldova, you can't tell my mom in Montana what's good for her immediately, but you've got to make the argument about how this serves the long-term national interests of the United States. And I'll say that the last book I did, and I still do quite a bit of talking around the country, I can tell you that there's a demand for it. Not everybody's going to agree with you, but this notion that Americans don't care about the world, that is just not my personal experience. I went to J.D. Vance's hometown in my last book talk because we had the same book agent at the time, and his book had just come out, and she was right. She said, this book is going to change. This book is going to be a bestseller. It's going to change this guy's life. I'm not so sure she is so, pretty sure she's a Democrat. But anyway, she was right. She predicted both those things right. And I read the book, and so I wanted to go to Middleton, Ohio. And I went, by the way. And by the way, Middleton, compared to where I grew up in Butte, Montana, feels like New York City. But I shouldn't have said that. Because is this being recorded to be broadcast? It is going to be broadcast?
Well, it's not related message.
Okay, all right.
To our millions of subscribers.
Okay, all right. I don't want to get in comparisons between Butte, Montana and Middleton, but what I want to say, and to Vice President Vance, if he cares, 500 people came to this talk, and it was a talk on Russia, Ukraine. The questions were somewhat different than the next day I was at MIT, but people were engaged. They didn't agree. Somebody that night, I remember very vividly, said, Mr. Ambassador, I know that Putin's a Christian. Why are you against Christians? And I can still remember it, right? That was a very valid question, and I had to wrestle with it and think about it. And I'm not sure I convinced him. I mean, there's Christians in Ukraine too, and I'm not sure Putin really is a Christian. We debated it, but I think that for me is a mission statement for this longer haul thing about. Otherwise, we're just gonna keep losing the arguments. And for me, it's about America 20 or 30, 40 years from now. I believe if we become this isolationist, nationalist place, we lose to the Chinese. I really, sincerely believe we will lose from that strategy, and I don't want to lose.
Well, I promised the audience 2 questions, but we are out of time, so I will ask the final one, which is,
okay.
Could you please remind us the title of your book and where we can get it and when?
I've only said it 5 times. No, you're joking, right? Thank you all. Thanks for having me.
All right, well, thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. And
that was great.